gap today in the BBC schedule, and I thought to jump in because I actually have a related talk to the last one that I gave, which was about compassion for the very rich or privileged. And of course, we also have to practice compassion for the very poor, right? So that's something that's been on my mind, especially with all the news about the changes in immigration policies and the treatment of migrants and undocumented people. So that's a topic that's very much on my mind these days, especially because I used to work in this field in many different aspects. Many years ago when I was a layperson, one of the first things I did was to interview the migrant communities in Singapore as part of an internship with with a theater company. And I wound up volunteering at a shelter for migrant workers in distress. So I really had the chance to, understand their stories and see what was happening. And then some years later, I wound up working on the government side of it, which had to do with policies related to, the lives and protections for migrant workers. And I will say, with that kind of context in mind, just seeing what is happening now in the news, it's of course distressing to me on many, many levels, but I will say unsurprising. Unfortunately, I have to say that. Like even having gone to global meetings about these migration issues long ago, it's like every country mistreats low-wage migrant workers from overseas. Why? Because this is how the self-centered thought works. We are the citizens, we have the rights, we are entitled, we are protected. You're the foreigner, plus you are poor, so, why do we need to take care of you, right? That's like the self-centered thought at the heart of it. We're going to take care of our own first. And time and again, I heard that when I talked to kind of my friends, family members, like well-meaning middle-class people, right, who you cannot demonize and say are bad. I would talk to them about these problems I was seeing with the migration framework in Singapore, for example, and they would be like, excuse me, we're giving them a job. Like, what do you mean the living conditions are inhumane? It's better than where they come from. Or like, why don't you take care of the poor in our country first? Why are you helping foreigners? I was just amazed by this kind of defensiveness that I met with repeatedly. So I kind of just, decided to really get off that moral high horse after a while. It's like, you just do the work that you believe in and keep going. Yeah. So instead of dwelling on all the problems and so on, I wanted to share today though about someone who I met while working in the nonprofit on the nonprofit side of things. This woman who really, really inspired me. And I found out that she passed away a few years ago, but she really dedicated her life to helping migrant workers in Singapore. And she was the founder of the shelter that I volunteered at. So her name is Bridget Tan, and from what I understand, she actually helped to start or was a key volunteer in this organization, I have to look at the name of it, called the Archdiocesan Commission for the Pastoral Care of Migrants and Itinerant People. Yeah, it was under the auspices of the Catholic Church in Singapore. She was a very devout Catholic. And, she had worked as a human resources manager, I think, worked her way up in human resources for many decades, and then she retired, and then she found herself called to helping migrants in distress. So under this, we call it in Singapore the ACMI, for that long acronym, she started a shelter for workers in distress. But I think the ACMI was not entirely in favor of running this shelter because, it gets complicated and political. So I think they decided to close it down. And so, so overnight you have these workers in distress who are going to be on the street, right? So Bridget was not going to take that she's not going to take that lying down. So basically she dug into her own personal savings and started renting spaces to house workers. So by the time I met her, she had a bungalow house rented for the women workers in distress, and then she had a shop house rented for the men. Yeah, so from what I know, really, she started everything from her personal savings. And by the time I met her, there were 2 social workers who were case workers helping them, go to labor court and help the workers to figure out what was going on. So that just knocked me out, first of all, that someone would do that. She was like an ordinary person like you and I, but she was just like, these workers need help. And I'm not going to let them go back out on the street. And it was a very precarious situation at the beginning renting these houses and housing the workers. She was, at the time, it was a legally registered organization, but yeah, she was basically on her own, trying to feed people in distress and help them with their legal cases and, scraping by. And I heard later too, she would just respond to distress calls, just go out and help people. I think one time it was people who thought I think there was a call about people being trafficked in some rural area, and she put herself at personal risk to go out there and check out the situation and basically alert the police after that, or rescue workers, so to speak. I had the chance to just interact with her while she was at the shelters. She was like everybody's mother. And it was not easy, managing a lot of people in stress, and having to deal with all the interpersonal relationships. And at the same time, you have the government kind of watching over you, like, who are these people and what are they doing? She was not always easy to get along with, I will say. She was a very fierce, founding people are like that, I guess. Single-minded, very clear about her principles and beliefs, and uncompromising, and she would just speak her truth. But I mean, that's very admirable too. So I volunteered with her for some period of time, and eventually I had to step back from the work I was doing with migrant workers because I was working for the government. So it was a very busy job. Plus, when you work for government, they are not so keen on you doing extracurricular things with civil society. Let's leave it at that. So I just had to step back. The best part was when I wound up working on the government side. That year, the U.S. I have to get the department right. The U.S. Department of State, under Hillary Clinton at the time, she was Secretary of State, decided to release a trafficking in persons report. And all these countries were, studied and investigated and reported on. And I think that year Singapore actually fell in its rankings for, so it was in trouble. And so a big part of my job in government at the time was like, how do we respond to this report? What is trafficking? I had to suddenly go and find out what trafficking meant and how come, the migration framework we have is being, criticized in that way, and so on. And at that time, Bridget received an award from the U.S. Department of State for the work she had done. Many, many other people too, I think. But she received the Hero Acting to End Modern-Day Slavery Award from Hillary Clinton herself. So of course she had no interest in awards whatsoever. I don't know how that came about, and she did go and receive the award. That was really, I would say, a thorn in the government's side. Right? Let's just put it that way mildly. So it was just very interesting for me to be kind of in the middle of it, watching that. And what was really inspiring for me personally was witnessing how the ambassador from the US side, who was there to present on the report, we had thought it was just going to be a, courtesy call kind of meeting. He actually knew all the facts on the ground. He had spoken, of course, I'm sure to Bridget, maybe, I don't know, to all the NGOs, and he knew all the problems with the labor migration framework. So at that meeting, he was asking some really, really hard questions that all of us were like, how does he know this? It was not a courtesy call. He meant business. So I was just so inspired that this ambassador actually knew of the details of what was happening in different countries on the ground and was using the soft power of the US, so to speak, to advocate for the world's poor. Yes, there was a time when the government was doing that. It was incredibly inspiring for me as someone witnessing that. And it makes governments pay attention, right? When the US used its power in that way, to say, hey, we're not gonna stand for these kinds of abuses. You should do something about them, or we might have to change the terms of trade that we have with you, and so on. So so Bridget received that award, and so now she's of course she just continued doing all the good work she does, and it was good to check back and see that her organization now is 20 years old, and she passed away in 2012. Before that, I knew I had read that she had a stroke. And when she had the stroke, she went to rehabilitate on Batam Island, which is this little island, maybe like a short ferry ride away from Singapore. And that is unfortunately also the central of sex trafficking. I will say a lot of women from Indonesia who think they're getting a job elsewhere wind up left there, you know, you don't have your passport and so on, and then you get trafficked into brothels there. Yeah, it's yeah. So of course Bridget has like some kind of partner NGO there. While recovering from her stroke, she I think starts a new nonprofit or something and starts working with all the people there on continuing her nonprofit work. Yeah, so that's the kind of person she was. And she inspired like a whole new generation of younger social workers and activists to keep going. So yes, in the midst of all this bad news, I was thinking of Bridget and thinking, you know, what can you do if you're feeling sad, upset, distressed, reading about what the current administration is doing to undocumented people, migrant workers, and so on. I mean, not all of us can be Bridget. I certainly couldn't. But I would say look for Bridget. Look for the Bridget in your community. They exist. There are already groups like that. There are people who are like, we're not going to lay down, you know, we're not going to stand for this kind of poor treatment of other human beings, even if everybody tells you it's okay and that, you know, you're just not going to stand for it. And they create communities, they create organizations, they find the money that's needed. So look for the Bridget, give her your money, support the good work she's doing or he's doing, volunteer. Yeah, there are just so many ways to get involved, and these are the organizations that really, really need our support right now. Yeah. So yeah, let's not despair or feel, you know, get into distress. Yeah, it's just been 7 weeks, and so it's a long road ahead, and yeah, one step at a time. No matter who is in power, migrants are going to be poorly treated, period. And so it's a very, very long journey, and I really respect all the people who've dedicated their lives to helping the world's poor. Every single country has them, and yeah, we have to do our part to support them as well.
We do the practices with this aspiration to be of benefit to beings, not to harm them, to benefit them. And in our understanding, the best benefit is to actually for beings to be liberated from cyclic existence, and we aim to become Buddhas in order to help beings to be free in this way. So generate those thoughts in your own way. So Venerable Chodu has laid out the sadhana for us, helping us to generate these various mind states. And she starts by having us think about all of our potential, all the kind of positive qualities that we can develop. Infinite love, compassion, wisdom, skillful means. So imagine what it would feel like to be those qualities. Just let yourself be love, wisdom, try to feel the expansiveness and peace in your heart. The wisdom that it takes to have this kind heart. To be unencumbered in any way. Vast and expansive. what's happening in this world, reaching out to every being, human and otherwise, to benefit each one. So now imagine that these qualities of love, compassion, wisdom, skillful means appear in front of you in the form of Shakyamuni Buddha. So imagine this Buddha in front of you, in the space in front of you made of radiant, transparent light. He's sitting on a throne, above which is an open lotus flower and cushions of the sun and moon discs. This entire visualization is made of radiant, transparent light. But you're imagining a living being with a light body. So you feel yourself in the presence of the Buddha. But Buddha's body is golden in color. He wears the robes of a monastic. His right hand, with the palm down, rests on his right knee. The earth touching mudra. In his left hand is in his lap holding a bowl of nectar. And this nectar is the medicine to cure our afflictions and all of our hindrances. And the Buddha's face is very beautiful. You can look at the Buddha's eyes. He's smiling. His eyes are smiling. He's looking at you with total acceptance. And as he looks at you, he's also encompassing all sentient beings. The Buddha's eyes are very peaceful, long and narrow. His lips are red and his earlobes are long. Imagine rays of light radiating from every pore of the Buddha's body. This golden light going out to all the parts of the universe, touching beings, carrying miniature Buddhas to help beings. And as they complete their work, they dissolve back into the Buddha. The Buddha is surrounded by the entire lineage of spiritual teachers, all the meditational deities, innumerable other Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Arhats, Dakas, Dakinis, Dharma protectors. And at the side, near each spiritual mentor, is an elegant table, and on it are Dharma books. The sounds of the Dharma fill the air. And they're all so happy that we're here doing this together. Imagine their minds just blissful and peaceful, gazing at all sentient beings. So you imagine that actually you are surrounded by all sentient beings in human form. Your mother of this life is on your left. Your father of this life is on your right. Any people you have difficulty with, you imagine in front of you, facing the Buddha, keeping them there for protection. Family and friends are nearby. Countless strangers fill the space around you. And all of us are looking to the Buddha for guidance. So first we need to cultivate a sense of refuge. So we think of all the dangers of cyclic existence. Just think about how things are not secure. Run into dissatisfaction, often dukkha, often And people, all the beings around us, all the sentient beings around us, are also in the same boat, floundering in cyclic existence. And many of them have not met any kind of teachings that will help them out of this quagmire. So we generate compassion. And now think of the wonderful qualities of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and generate this sense of confidence in them, in their ability to guide you out of all of these recurring problems. To take refuge, we need the causes, this kind of concern, this kind of alarm, fear, and also this confidence and faith, and the compassion. So it is possible, on the basis of your present life and mind, to free yourself from all of these undesirable experiences. So resolve to explore that possibility to the fullest. Feel great trust and confidence in the three jewels, and open your heart to rely upon them to guide you and others from all of these difficulties of cyclic existence and bring us to the peace, liberation, and full awakening. So as we do these refuge verses, starting here, now we're on the top of page 21, we'll be taking refuge in the Buddha, and we imagine actually leading all of the sentient beings around us and going for refuge. And we visualize white, radiant light flowing from all of the Buddhas, the spiritual mentors, the Bodhisattvas, all of these holy beings flowing into us and all the beings around us. And this light completely purifies all of our destructive karmic imprints and afflictions. And it also brings all the realizations of the path. So put your hands in prayer position. Namo Guru Vya. Namo Buddhaya. Namo Dharmaya. Nama Sangaya. Namo Guruvya. 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 Namo Buddhaya. Namo Dharmaya. Nama Sangaya. So feel that you've come under the protection of the three jewels. And now we turn our thoughts to others and think about how much we depend on other beings for everything that we have, everything we know, everything we use, everything we enjoy. Our food, clothing, resources of every kind. These come due to the efforts of others. Our knowledge, talents, good qualities, these too are developed due to the kindness of others. And our ability to practice the Dharma certainly depends on others who brought the teachings to us over the millennia by generating realizations in their mind and teaching. So this is a very great kindness, all of these things we want to bring to mind. Our innermost wish is to be free from suffering. And this is the case for everyone else as well. We want to be happy. All beings want to be happy. And like us, they encounter many difficulties, problems, sufferings. And usually, actually, their difficulties are more so than our own. Not always, but often. And when we examine our capacity to help beings, we find that we're actually quite limited. And we know from our practice that if we can reduce our anger, our attachment, our ignorance, our various faults, if we can increase all of our good qualities, we're really going to be in a position to benefit beings. Imagine if we had just this generous heart, gives so easily, takes delight in giving, the kind of ethics that doesn't harm, because that just ingrained. Fortitude, loving kindness, compassion, wisdom, will be in excellent position to help beings by having our good qualities developed. And if we develop them fully, like a Buddha does, then we'll be able to be of the greatest benefit to beings. So we generate this altruistic intention in order to be able to benefit beings most effectively. So as we take refuge and generate bodhicitta, imagine that light is flowing into you from all of these Buddhas and holy beings. And it's flowing into you and all the sentient beings around you. So we're on the top of page 22. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by engaging in generosity and the other far-reaching practices, may I attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by engaging in generosity and the other far-reaching practices, may I attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create by engaging in generosity and the other far-reaching practices, may I attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. So imagine the Buddha is so pleased with your altruistic intention. And a replica emerges from the Buddha, comes to the crown of your head, melts into golden light, flows into you. Feel that you and the Buddha have become inseparable. Feel very close to the Buddha and allow your mind to be transformed and inspired. Let go of all conceptions you have about yourself. Let go of any self-denigrating thoughts. Let go of the concept of inherent existence and meditate on emptiness. At your heart appears a small Buddha made of light. He radiates the light of wisdom and compassion in all directions throughout the entire universe. And this light transforms all sentient beings into Buddhas and all environments into pure lands, which are places where all the circumstances are conducive to practicing the Dharma and generating realizations. So imagine this. You've transformed all sentient beings into Buddhas and all environments into pure lands in your imagination. Oh, why hasn't this become a reality? We sentient beings have bias, prejudice, we lack love, compassion, and joy. So now we want to wish ourselves and others to have all of these qualities. So we contemplate the four immeasurables. We do this to reinforce our own felt experience of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity for everyone. Friends, strangers, enemies, relatives, people you don't like, who you don't trust, anyone, everyone. So as we say those four immeasurables, you want to listen to yourself say the words and contemplate as you recite. So we'll pause between each of the four. May all sentient beings have happiness and its causes. May all sentient beings be free of suffering and its causes. May all sentient beings not be separated from sorrowless bliss. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free of bias, attachment, and anger. So, in order to achieve what we've just been aspiring towards, we need to purify our negativities, and we need a lot of merit. need to abandon things and adopt things. So when we do the 7-limb prayer, this encompasses all this abandoning and adopting things. So we'll pause after each line. And you want to put your hands in the prayer position for this. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. So imagine yourself and all the beings, the sentient beings around you, making prostrations to all the holy beings in front of you in the field of merit, repeatedly prostrating. And present clouds of every type of offering, actual and mentally transformed. So imagine offering everything beautiful to the Buddha and all the holy beings. You can fill the sky with offerings. Make it very lovely and beautiful. You can think of flowers and fields and just everything that you love. Offer to all the holy beings. You can do this repeatedly. I confess all my destructive actions accumulated since beginningless time. So now we do like a glance meditation of the 4 permanent powers. So for this, bring to mind something that you wish to purify, some fault or mistake. Bring it clearly to mind and generate regret for that. The other permanent powers are taking refuge in generating bodhicitta, which we're doing in the practice. The practice itself will be the remedial action, but make a determination not to do this action again. And rejoice in the virtues of all holy and ordinary beings. So think of common sentient beings like ourselves, the holy beings, and delight and take, rejoice in all of the virtue created by any kind of being. Let go of any jealousy, envy, and just rejoice in the goodness of the world. Use your own life experience. Think of things, people that you want to rejoice. In the next verse, please remain until cyclic existence ends. So now we offer a double dorje. This symbolizes long life. We offer this to the holy beings. We do this requesting them to live long, to always be a part of our life. And you can do this multiple times in your imagination. And then the next verse. And turn the wheel of Dharma for sentient beings. So again, make this offering. You're offering with both hands this beautiful 1,000-spoke Dharma wheel, golden in color. Offering this to the teachers and the Buddhas to guide you and to continue to teach the Dharma. And then the 7th room. I dedicate all the virtues of myself and others to the Great Awakening. So now we steer these limbs toward full awakening for ourselves and all beings. Now we'll offer the mandala. Here we imagine everything beautiful in the universe, offering it to all the holy beings with the wish that they will continue to teach and guide us and that we can generate realizations in our mind. This ground Flower-strewn Mount Meru, for land, sun, and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you. May all beings enjoy this pure land. The objects of attachment, aversion, and ignorance, friends, enemies, and strangers, my body, wealth, and enjoyments, I offer these without any sense of loss. Please accept them with pleasure and inspire me and others to be free from the three poisonous attitudes. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayam. So imagine all the holy beings just delighted, and they receive your offerings. And the offerings melt into light and dissolve into them, and these all absorb into the Buddha's heart. And then immediately he radiates light back to you, filling your body and mind. And this light inspires you to accomplish the path to full awakening. So in order to progress along the path, we need to develop realizations. And in order to do this, we need the inspiration of the lineage of spiritual mentors, especially your principal teacher or your root guru, who is the one who has touched your heart deeply. If you don't have a specific teacher, just think about Shakyamuni Buddha, or maybe you have a connection in your mind with His holiness. And we make this request, page 25. Glorious and precious root guru, sit upon the lotus and moon seat on my calm, guiding me with your great kindness. Bestow upon me the attainments of your body, speech, and mind. And so then, at this point, you imagine that a replica of your teacher in the aspect of the Buddha emerges from the Buddha in front of you. And it comes to sit on a lotus and moon disc on the crown of your head, facing the same direction as you. So then this Buddha on the crown of your head is going to act as an advocate for you to request inspiration from the entire field of merit as we continue the request. And we're doing the long one on page 26. Buddha, unequal teacher and guide, venerable protector Maitreya, successor, superior Sangha prophesied by Buddha, to you three Buddhas and Bodhisattvas I make request. Buddha, head of the Shakya clan, the foremost guide, peerless in expounding emptiness, Manjushri, embodiment of the Buddha's complete wisdom, exalted Nagarjuna, best of the superiors who sees the profound meaning, to you three crowning jewels of clear exposition I make request. Atisha, upholder of this great vehicle, who sees the profundity of dependent arising, Drome Rinpoche, elucidator of this good path. To these two ornaments of the world I make request. Avalokiteshvara, great treasure of oblivious compassion. Manjushri, masteress, flawless wisdom. Tsongkhapa, crown jewel of the snowy land sages. Losangrappa, I make request at your feet. Holder of the white lotus, embodiment of all the conqueror's compassion. Guide benefiting migrating beings in the land of snow mountains and beyond. Sole deity and refuge, Tenzin Gyatso, at your feet I make request. The eyes through whom the vast scriptures are seen, supreme doors for the fortunate who would cross over to spiritual freedom, illuminators whose wise means vibrate with compassion. To the entire line of spiritual mentors I make request. So imagine all of the figures in the field of merit melting into light, dissolving into you. Into the central figure of the Buddha in front of you. All the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas, the Arhats, Dakas, Dakinis, Dharma protectors, all of these beings melt into light, dissolve into the central figure of Shakyamuni Buddha. And now Shakyamuni Buddha embodies the three jewels And this Buddha absorbs into the Buddha on the crown of your head. And then as we recite the Buddha's mantra, try to let your mind be very open, receptive. Imagine this white light flowing into you from the Buddha on the crown of your head. It purifies all your negativities, all your obscurations, and it generates within you the realizations of the stages of the path. So we'll recite the Buddha's mantra together. Tayata Om Mune Mune Maha Mune Soha. 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 Now, we establish the visualization of Shakyamuni Buddha above the crown of your head, made of golden, transparent, radiant light, a living being. And this Buddha melts into light and dissolves into you. Your body, speech, and mind become inseparable from those of the Buddha. the dedication prayers, starting on the page that we're on in the sadhana, which is 27. Due to this merit, may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. So, realistic expectations. You have to kind of watch because
Idealism or Materialism, Two Approaches to the World, by J. Sykes. When we talk about the philosophy that forms the basis of Marxism-Leninism, we say that that philosophy is dialectical materialism. At this point in our series on the theoretical concepts of Marxism-Leninism, we are going to focus on the materialism of dialectical materialism and try to come to a clear understanding of what that means. And to do that, we're going to also look at materialism's philosophical opposite, idealism. Ultimately, materialism and idealism are two opposing ways of approaching every question that we might take up. Many might consider this too abstract a point for revolutionaries to wish to pay attention to, or they may mistake this for some sort of moral judgment about people. The common understanding of these terms would lend itself to such a view. The everyday view is that an idealist is a person concerned with high-minded ideals, whereas a materialist is someone concerned with accumulating or possessing material things. Philosophically, this isn't what the terms mean at all, as we shall see. We need to dispel this view and understand what these terms mean philosophically. They actually connect in a very important way with what we previously talked about in our articles on how we know and how we learn, epistemology. The battle between idealism and materialism in fact divides the history of human thought into two camps. A materialist is someone who says being is primary over thinking. An idealist says the opposite, that thinking is primary over being. In other words, a materialist thinks that being determines thinking, while an idealist thinks the opposite, that thinking determines being. Similarly, idealism is dualistic. Separating ideas from matter is two fundamental metaphysical substances. Materialism is monastic, uniting ideas and matter as two components of one social reality. This is the main distinction, though it is still very abstract. We might simplify it by saying that a materialist starts with things the way they are, while an idealist starts with the way they want things to be. But that doesn't give us the whole picture. Let's take each one by one, starting with idealism. Beginning with ancient religious thinking, and even before that, faced with a complex and turbulent existence, human beings tried to understand why things happened as they did. When there was a storm, the failure of crops, a military victory, or a great tragedy, people wanted to understand why these things happened. With no scientific understanding of nature, often the recourse was to say, it is as the gods will it, or perhaps it was fate or karma that caused things to happen as they did. People tried to understand what it was that made up the world around them. Early idealist philosophers weren't satisfied with religious explanations, and so speculated that reality didn't exist apart from the mind, and that the ideas that made up reality had their own existence apart from the material world, and that it is these ideas that shape what reality is. This tradition in philosophy leads from the ancient Greeks like Socrates and Plato to modern philosophers such as Kant, Hegel, and Berkeley. The world was created from ideas in some way or another. Idealism reigned supreme in the ancient slave societies and under feudal social relations, when the temples and the church were the main ideological levers of the ruling class. The king ruled because it was God's will. One suffered because it was one's fate. If you were born into a lower caste, it was karma, and you were being punished for the misdeeds of your past lives. This kind of thinking served the needs of the slave societies and feudal lords well. But even among the ancients, early attempts at materialism were made. Ancient Greeks and Indian philosophy separately developed philosophies of atomism. They posited that there were basic atoms that made up the world. Some said that basic elements like earth, air, water, or fire, or some combination of these elements, made up the world. Modern materialists like Hobbes, Diderot, and Feuerbach brought materialism into the modern scientific age. To materialists, ideas arose from nature, as human thought arises from our material existence. Nevertheless, materialism didn't really take hold as a dominant position in ideology until the Enlightenment, with the rise of the bourgeoisie. This is why the French Revolution at the end of the 1700s was so emphatic about secularism. The overthrow of feudalism also required the overthrow of the ideological domination of the church. Not only was the political power to be moved out of the hands of the feudal lords into the hands of the rising bourgeoisie, but the ideology of the divine right of kings had to be struck down as the basis of that claim to power. Scientific thinking and secularism were required to push forward the productive forces of society and develop modern industry. Newtonian physics saw the world as functioning like a great machine operating according to natural laws. Everything was in its place and every effect could be traced to a definite material cause. This mechanical or metaphysical materialism didn't see this great systematic machine as dynamic and changing as a result of its internal contradictions, but as fixed, immutable, and unchanging. Natural laws enshrined as the reason things are as they are. Everything to the mechanical materialist is exact, distinct, and repeatable, like clockwork. Mechanical materialism, however, rests on a number of dogmatic assumptions. The British Marxist philosopher Maurice Cornforth enumerates them as follows in his book Dialectical Materialism. First, all change is based on permanent things with stable and fixed properties. Second, change only occurs due to external causes. Third, all change can be reduced to the mechanical motion of particles. And fourth, things exist in a separation from other things as independent units. While the rise of modern metaphysical materialism was a step in the right direction, we are still a long way away from the dialectical materialism developed by Marx and Engels, which will advance materialism beyond these dogmatic assumptions listed above. It does this by divorcing materialism from the metaphysical method of analysis and by uniting materialism with dialectics. Having looked at what distinguishes materialism from idealism, in our next article we'll look at the difference between dialectics and metaphysics. From this, we should be able to get a clear picture of what dialectical materialism is and what it means for us as revolutionaries. Idealism or Materialism: Two Approaches to the World, by J. Sykes, circulated by Fightback News. Red Theory: Dialectics or Metaphysics? Two Methods of Analysis, by J. Sykes. In our last article, we saw that Marxism-Leninism bases itself on a materialist worldview, but we saw, at the same time, that materialism as it became to be understood with the rise of bourgeois society was still metaphysical in its method of analysis. At this point, let's look at the difference between the metaphysical and dialectical method. Then we can better understand how Karl Marx established the philosophical basis of revolutionary science, dialectical materialism. Metaphysics is a subject of philosophy that really begins, at least in the West, with Aristotle in ancient Greece, and is intended to look at that which lies beyond the senses, or outside the realm of perceptual experience. Friedrich Engels, in his book Ludwig Feuerbach and The End of Classical German Philosophy, calls metaphysics the old method of investigation and thought, which preferred to investigate things as given, as fixed and stable, a method the relics of which still strongly haunt people's minds. This might seem very abstract, but actually we encounter metaphysical thinking all the time, haunting people's minds in our movements and forming the basis of all kinds of blind alleys, strategic and tactical missteps, and opportunistic tendencies. For example, Reformist thinking is based on a view that social progress can be a process of peaceful, quantitative growth, and that no qualitative leap is necessary. This is the view of both bourgeois liberals and the so-called democratic socialists. At the same time, reactionaries of all stripes believe that nothing can, or should, fundamentally change. We encounter lots of folks who peddle the idea that things are the way they are just by accident, rather than as the result of a historical process that brought us to where we are, therefore obscuring the root causes of the current state of things. And of course, many people don't understand how internal contradictions drive a given process, and thus find themselves unable to navigate these contradictions as they unfold. The dialectical method sweeps aside metaphysical thinking on all of these points and gives us the tools we need to combat it. Engels goes into all of this at length in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. To the metaphysician, things in their mental reflexes, ideas, are isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation fixed, rigid, given once for all. He thinks an absolute, irreconcilable antithesis. For him, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in rigid antithesis, one to the other. Engels goes on to say that dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things in their representations, ideas, in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. We see then that metaphysical materialism stops short of seeing how contradictory forces, both within and without, can change a given thing and even cause things to transform into their opposite. It ignores how matter and ideas affect one another, and indeed can transform into one another, for ideas can become a material force in history when taken up by the masses. We have already seen how this works in our previous articles on the Marxist theory of knowledge in the mass line. Marxist-Leninist epistemology is not only materialist, but is fundamentally dialectical. So much for metaphysics. Let's look more closely at dialectics. Like metaphysics, dialectics too has its root in ancient philosophy. Socrates and Plato were both famous for their dialectical method. They believed that when two contradictory arguments were set against each other, reason could allow for a higher understanding to be reached. Later, the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel took this idea further in developing his philosophy of dialectical materialism. It was Hegel who first systematized the dialectic. To put it as simply as possible, Hegel argued that there was a dialectical process of historical progression towards reason, where one thing is contradicted by another, leading to their sublation, or overcoming. Often this is described in terms of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, with the synthesis carrying forward some remainder as the thesis and antithesis are both overcome in something qualitatively new. Marx and Engels understood that within Hegel's dense, idealist system, there was an important key to understanding historical and social change. Hegel understood contradiction to be inherent to progress. Marx took the Hegelian dialectic and put it on a materialist basis. With him, it is standing on its head. It must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. The materialist inversion of the Hegelian dialectic means that Marx and Engels started with the material conditions of human beings as they worked to satisfy their material needs. Human society, they saw, has always been organized around its tools and the productive relations arising from that. From that, they understood the historical development of classes and of class struggle as the motive force of history. They illuminated how classes and class struggle drive forth the contradictions in any given historical period, leading towards revolution and advancement towards a new and higher stage, leading to new contradictions, ever onward. Finally, this brings us to another important point. It should be noted that Hegel's idealist dialectic is teleological, which means it has a fixed end or final cause that everything is being drawn towards. For Hegel, this is the actualization of God in the world through reason, the end of history. The materialist dialectic of Marxism has no such teleological end. From a dialectical materialist viewpoint, there is no reason to believe that there will ever be a time when all contradictions are resolved and there is no more struggle and thus no more progress. By applying the rational kernel of the Hegelian dialectic to modern materialism, the laws that govern social and historical change are finally revealed. Engels lists these laws of the dialectic as follows: the law of the unity and struggle of opposites, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, and the negation of the negation. All of these may be summed up as particular aspects of dialectical contradiction. In our forthcoming articles, we will examine each of these in greater detail before advancing to an analysis of historical materialism, which is Marx's application of the materialist dialectic to history. Dialectics or Metaphysics, Two Methods of Analysis, by J. Sykes, published by Fightback News. Contradiction, The Kernel of Dialectics, by J. Sykes. Friedrich Engels lists 3 laws of dialectics, but, as we shall see, the most important is the law of contradiction, which he calls the law of the interpenetration of opposites. Before we discuss the other two, the transformation of quantity into quality and the negation of the negation, let's look closely at contradiction. Many of the great theorists of Marxism-Leninism wrote about dialectics in general and contradiction in particular. Mao Zedong extrapolated from the writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, along with the direct experience of the Chinese Revolution, a systemic theory of materialist dialectics, particularly in his essay on contradiction. He was the first to explain dialectics in terms of the uneven development of contradictions, of principal and secondary contradictions, and, within that, of principal and secondary aspects of those contradictions. What, then, is a contradiction? When we talk about contradiction, we're talking about two opposing forces within any given concrete process? Contradiction is universal. The interaction of opposing forces takes place within all phenomena. Lenin said, the splitting in two of a single whole and the cognition of its contradictory parts is the essence of dialectics. Marx's great work, Capital, is an analysis of the particular contradictions at work, from top to bottom, within bourgeois society. Through looking at those contradictions, Marx was able to demonstrate the laws of motion that govern capitalist society. Capitalism is a complex process. Thus, in capitalism, there are many contradictions at work at the same time. There is the contradiction between the ruling class of exploiters, the bourgeoisie, and the class of exploited, the working class or proletariat. But capitalism also brings with it monopolies, imperialism, national oppression, and so on. There are numerous classes and social groups with their own interests and struggles. Even among the various strata of a particular class, there are different contradictions. But if we look closely at all of these contradictions, we find that capitalism is at the root of all of them. In his analysis of capitalism, Marx found that the basis of the class struggle within the capitalist mode of production is the contradiction between the social character of production and the private character of accumulation. Millions of people work in a complex division of labor to produce the wealth of society, while that wealth is accumulated in the hands of a small minority of people who own the means of production. In other words, production is social, but profit is private. This contradiction is the basis of the class struggle and the driving force behind the cycles of capitalist crisis. Mao says this contradiction is fundamental and points out that even as capitalism developed into its current stage, imperialism, this fundamental contradiction at the core of capitalism itself remained. As long as capitalism continues to exist, this fundamental contradiction continues to sharpen. The eventual resolution of this contradiction through proletarian revolution will mark the end of capitalism and the beginning of a new process, that of socialist construction. While the fundamental contradiction between social production and private accumulation is basic to what capitalism is, there are still many other contradictions at work in such a complex process, and these contradictions can play lesser or greater roles at different times and under different conditions. The principal or determining contradiction within that can also change, given the dynamics of the situation. Mao argues that, in capitalist society, the two forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, form the principal contradiction. However, Mao argues that in national liberation wars against imperialism, the principal contradiction is different, as the class conflicts within that nation take a back seat to the struggle for liberation. we can expand or reduce the scope of our analysis to look at contradictions operating on a global scale, down to the contradictions operating on a very small, local scale. Currently, we live in the era of imperialism. Imperialism, led by the United States, strives to dominate the world politically, militarily, and economically, and the principal contradiction on a global scale is the contradiction between imperialism and the oppressed nations. To say that other contradictions are secondary isn't to diminish their importance, but rather to say that these contradictions are influenced and determined by the principal contradiction. We can't deal with principal or secondary contradictions if we don't know which is which. For this reason, Mao stressed that once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can be readily solved. Likewise, contradictions develop unevenly. In any given contradiction, one side of that contradiction is the principal or dominant aspect. The principal aspect of the contradiction is what plays the leading role within that contradiction, and the nature of a thing is determined by the aspect which plays this leading role. But the principal and secondary aspects also can exchange places. For example, in capitalist society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat exist side by side, but the bourgeoisie plays the leading role. In socialist society, the proletariat will take over the leading role to dismantle capitalist productive relations and build socialism. So we see then that when the principal and secondary aspects of a contradiction exchange places, it causes a qualitative change in the situation. This understanding of how contradictions operate in complex processes gives us a deeper understanding of the laws of motion that govern that process. For this reason, dialectical materialism is a powerful tool for revolutionaries to break down a complex process and determine where and how to act. It is on the basis of this dialectical analysis of the terrain and struggle in the United States that we talk about a united front against monopoly capitalism. Under the leadership of the working class and its party, with the strategic alliance of the multinational working class and the movement of oppressed nationalities as its core, this is a strategy for revolution, based on the concrete analysis of our concrete conditions, which takes into account the complex matrix of principal and secondary contradictions, both within the imperialist United States and on a global scale. This method of analysis also functions on a tactical level, in particular on the ground struggles. We can use dialectical materialism to find the principal and secondary contradictions at work in a given struggle, such as in a union contract negotiation or in struggles against police brutality, and use that analysis to look at the interests of the different forces at work, how they interact, and where to aim our blows. In our next article, we will proceed to look more deeply at the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction, and then at the question of the role played by antagonism in a contradiction. This will further help us to understand how to apply this method, especially when it comes to questions of different ways of handling contradictions between the masses and the enemy and contradictions among the masses of the people themselves. Contradiction, the Kernel of Dialectics, by J. Sykes, published by Fight Back News. On Identity and Antagonism and Contradiction, by J. Sykes. In our last article, we looked at some of the core concepts of dialectical materialism. We broke down the meaning of contradiction, and we looked at how contradictions develop unevenly in complex processes into principal and secondary contradictions. We also looked at how any given contradiction has its own principal and secondary aspects, with the principal aspect playing the dominant role. Now let's look more closely at identity and contradiction and the role of antagonism in resolving contradictions of different types. In On Contradiction, Mao Zedong writes, in speaking of the identity of opposites in given contradictions, what we are referring to is real and concrete opposites, and the real and concrete transformations of opposites into one another. In one sense, identity means that the two aspects of a given contradiction are also contradictions for each other's existence. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without the proletariat, and vice versa. The class of exploiters depends entirely on the existence of a class of exploited from whom they draw their wealth and over whom they wield their power. Without the class of exploiters, the exploited too would not exist as a class. In this contradiction, the capitalist class plays the dominant role. They control the means of production, along with the superstructure of the state and its repressive and ideological apparatuses. However, the two aspects of this contradiction can exchange places. As Mao puts it, by means of revolution, the proletariat, at one time the ruled, is transformed into the ruler, while the bourgeoisie, the erstwhile ruler, is transformed into the ruled and changes its position to that originally occupied by its opposite. From this qualitatively new position, the proletariat can wield state power in the socialist transformation to eliminate exploitation, thereby eliminating the contradictions for the existence of both itself and the bourgeoisie as classes. One way to think about this is to say that identity is what holds things together. In other words, identity represents the real concrete relationships that bind these opposing forces to each other. In the case of the working class and capitalists, these are the real concrete relations of production. The capitalists own the means of production, and workers have to sell their labor to the capitalists to survive. Nevertheless, Lenin makes an important point here. The unity, coincidence, identity, equal action, of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. This is crucial for revolutionaries to grasp. Struggle and change are both constant and necessary. So to sum up, identity is the concrete relationship between contradictory aspects. On the one hand, it means that the two aspects of a contradiction are interdependent. On the other hand, it means that they can change places between which aspect is principal and which is secondary. But what role does antagonism play in the identity and struggle of opposites? Mao says that antagonism is one form, but not the only form, of the struggle of opposites, in his essay on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. Mao divides contradictions into two categories: those between the masses of the people and the enemy, and those among the people themselves. Contradictions between the people and the enemy are antagonistic. Contradictions among the people are non-antagonistic. For example, under capitalist society, the contradiction between the capitalists and the working class is an antagonistic contradiction. The capitalists derive their wealth through the exploitation of the workers. They get rich from the surplus value produced by workers. That is, the difference between the value added by living labor and the amount the capitalists pay the workers for that labor power. Over the long run, the more wealth the capitalists accumulate, the less the workers are able to take home and pay, and vice versa. This means the material interests of these two classes are directly and irreconcilably opposed to one another. One benefits only at the expense of the other. But there also exist contradictions among the masses of the people themselves. These contradictions are not antagonistic, not irreconcilably opposed to one another. Non-antagonistic contradictions are resolved through a process of unity, criticism, unity. This is a peaceful and democratic method of resolving non-antagonistic contradictions that means starting from the desire for unity, resolving contradictions through criticism or struggle, and arriving at a new unity on a new basis. This is the way communists should seek to resolve contradictions among themselves and among the broad masses of the people. This brings to a close our preliminary discussion of the primary law of dialectics, the law of contradiction, which Engels calls the law of interpenetration of opposites. It is one of our most powerful and important theoretical tools and deserves serious and ongoing study, well beyond the limitations of these short articles. From here, we understand how contradiction operates well enough to proceed, and so in our next article, we will look more closely at how contradiction operates in the transformation of quantity into quality. On Identity and Antagonism and Contradiction, by J. Sykes, published by Fight Back News. The Leap from Quantity to Quality, by J. Sykes. Now that we've gone into some detail on contradiction, let's look at the question of the transformation of quantity into quality. In his book, Dialectics of Nature, Engels names 3 dialectical laws: the laws of the interpenetration of opposites, which we've already dealt with, the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, and the negation of the negation. However, it is noteworthy that Mao Zedong argues that contradiction is the primary law of dialectics. The other 2 laws are either merely an instance of the law of contradiction, in the case of the transformation of quantity into quality, or a metaphysical carryover of Hegelian idealism, in the case of the negation of the negation. It is worthwhile to examine this in some detail. Here, we'll look at the question of how qualitative leaps are in fact instances of the law of contradiction. In what way is the leap from quantity to quality actually an instance of the law of contradiction? Mao makes short work of this in his Talk on Questions of Philosophy, stating that the transformation of quantity into quality is simply a matter of the unity of opposites, quantity and quality. In fact, what takes place dialectically is that quantitative accumulation eventually causes a shift in the uneven development of contradictory forces, and the previously secondary aspect of a contradiction becomes primary or dominant within the process, manifesting as a qualitative leap. Metaphysical thinking would have it that change is only a change into quantity. This vulgar evolutionist approach to change fails to account for the dialectical leap from quantity to quality. Often this is expressed as a kind of reformism in the movements in which we work. Liberal reformists believe that we can create a just society through a series of incremental changes, and that revolution isn't actually necessary. Social democrats commit a similar error. They misunderstand the transformation of quantity into quality because they don't understand that it is a function of dialectical contradiction. They believe that if enough social democratic reforms are accumulated, then the capitalist state can be transformed into a socialist state without a proletarian revolution to overthrow the power of the bourgeoisie. These reformists misunderstand not only the place of antagonism in the class struggle, but also the way that principal and secondary aspects of contradiction exchange places. It isn't a question of the incremental accumulation of reforms, but of the accumulation of force, of power, that determines which aspect of a contradiction is dominant. What we actually see when we look at the history of social change over and over again is that a series of small changes eventually leads to a revolutionary leap, after which things are fundamentally different and the situation is qualitatively new. For example, we may see that a series of quantitative steps, such as increasing exploitation in our workplace, can build alongside workers' frustration. Workplace actions may build up in a quantitative way through meetings, leafleting, and the eventual move towards indirect shop floor tactics like slowdowns or work to rule. Eventually, the principal and secondary aspects of the contradiction at work change places, resulting in a qualitative leap into a direct confrontation between the workers and bosses and the workers' strike. As we have already seen in our study of contradiction, qualitative change occurs when the principal and secondary aspects of a contradiction change place. Look at this passage from Mao's essay on contradiction. But this situation is not static. The principal and the non-principal aspects of a contradiction transform themselves into each other, and the nature of the thing changes accordingly. In a given process, or at a given stage in the development of a contradiction, A is the principal aspect and B is the non-principal aspect. At another stage, or in another process, the roles are reversed, a change determined by the extent of the increase or decrease in the force of each aspect in its struggle against the other in the course of the development of a thing. Let's examine Mao's argument here by returning to our example of the workers' struggle. As the struggle progresses, the workers escalate their tactics, applying greater and greater pressure. Class struggle develops consciousness and organization, and the quantitative accumulation of these things leads to a qualitative leap in the struggle. The strike will be won or lost depending on the accumulation of force by the workers, and whether or not the workers have accumulated the force necessary to become the principal aspect of the contradiction in this particular struggle, that is, the dominant force in the process. If the workers haven't built up their forces, escalated their tactics step by step to raise the consciousness of the broad rank and file, and built their strike fund, then their relative lack of power will make it a difficult struggle to win. If this quantitative accumulation of force has taken place, however, then and only then is a qualitative leap possible, such that the workers become the dominant force in the process, and on that basis can seize the time, appropriately advance their tactics, and win the strike. So we see then the way in which dialectical materialism accounts for qualitative change. Mao is correct to say that the transformation of quantity into quality is an instance of the law of contradiction. In our next essay, we will examine the third law of dialectics as presented by Engels, the negation of the negation. The Leap from Quantity to Quality by J. Sykes, published by Fightback News. On the Negation of the Negation by J. Sykes. In our study of the three laws of dialectics presented by Engels, we've examined the law of contradiction and the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. Finally, Engels says that the third law of dialectics is the law of the negation of the negation. We have seen that Mao Zedong has argued that the law of contradiction is the primary law of dialectics. In our last article, we looked at how the transformation of quantity into quality was, in fact, an instance of the law of contradiction. Here, we will examine Mao's argument against the negation of the negation as a dialectical law. First, what does the negation of the negation mean? And why have Marxists thought of it as a worthwhile way to explain dialectical process? The concept comes from the most advanced philosophy of the time in which Marx and Engels were working, Hegel's dialectical idealism. It describes a process in a sequence of steps, starting with an affirmation, followed by a negation that arises as a result of that affirmation, and then followed by a negation of that negation. Hegel was talking about ideas, and so talked about this in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Engels makes use of this Hegelian language in referring to the negation of the negation as a dialectical law, but this has the potential to create some confusion among Marxists that we would benefit from sorting out. Materialist dialectics is concerned with material reality, not just ideas. So to illustrate this sequence, let's consider capitalism as our first affirmation. Marx says the bourgeoisie creates its own gravediggers. In other words, bourgeois society creates its own negation, the proletariat, a class born out of capitalism itself. Capitalism itself gives rise to the necessity of socialist revolution. The proletariat, through socialist revolution, therefore negates the bourgeoisie, capitalist relations, and so on, step by step. But in doing so, the proletariat also eliminates the conditions for its own existence as a class. This is what Lenin describes in The State and Revolution as socialism's withering away, which allows for a stateless and classless society, communism, to come forth. This is the second negation, the negation of the negation, by this way of looking at it. Taken step by step, we see that first we have the original affirmation, the thesis. This is capitalism in our illustration. This is followed by an antithesis, which arises from and negates the original thesis. This is the first negation, socialism. Finally, we have the synthesis, which negates the antithesis that had negated the original thesis, communism. Thus, the final synthesis is the negation of the negation. Essentially, in this progression of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the final synthesis serves to negate the antithesis that itself negated the original thesis, while also preserving elements of both in a new unity or identity. In this process, the law of the negation is what accounts for the spiral development that makes progress, rather than mere repetition, possible. This synthesis carries forward something from both the original affirmation and the first negation, synthesizing them, that is, uniting them, into something qualitatively new. This new unity becomes a new thesis, or a new affirmation, and the sequence begins again, but at a higher level than before. This conception of the dialectic accounts for progress by describing how this step-by-step process leads from one thing to the next, based on resolving the contradictions that arise from the process. Of course, this isn't entirely incorrect, but it is inaccurate. This inaccuracy can lead to some confusion as to what is really taking place dialectically. The law of the negation is helpful to a point, but we have to go further. Revolutionary science can't rest within simple explanations. The thinking behind the law of the negation confuses the issue in two interrelated ways. First, it gives too linear an understanding of dialectics, which doesn't account for the complex processes where multiple contradictions are at work at the same time, which we've described in our articles on contradiction. And second, by starting and ending with identity, it enshrines identity or unity as primary over contradiction or struggle. To truly put the dialectic on a materialist basis also means, as Mao says in his talk on questions of philosophy, to understand that every link in the chain of events is both affirmation and negation. In other words, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis aren't separated from each other in a metaphysical way. Affirmation and negation are present at every moment of any given process. In his essay on contradiction, Mao made a great contribution to the Marxist-Leninist philosophy of dialectical materialism by clearly explaining that the materialist dialectic cannot be understood as a simple, linear sequence, but as a complex structural matrix of many unevenly developed contradictions, all at work simultaneously. It is important to note that if we ignore the complexity of contradiction in favor of a simple, linear sequence, we risk taking a mechanical approach to solving problems by failing to recognize the significance of secondary contradictions in the situation. People who claim that everything that isn't pure class struggle is a distraction are guilty of this error. Furthermore, the law of the negation preserves a Hegelian metaphysical framework. The Hegelian dialectic begins and ends with identity, mediated by struggle. The first identity is the thesis of Hegel's triad, the original affirmation, and the Hegelian synthesis, the negation, is a new identity, with struggle, antithesis, acting merely as a bridge between them. This is an important point. In the Hegelian sequence, contradiction exists primarily between identities rather than within them. Here, identity is absolute and struggle is relative. In reality, on the contrary, contradiction is present within and essential to every moment of the process. Bourgeois society contains a multitude of contradictions, affirmations and negations, as does socialism, and so will communism. Struggle is inherent in every part of the process. Every identity is teeming with contradictions. If we don't grasp this point, we will think that external contradictions should be the focus of our attention, rather than internal contradictions that tend to drive things forward. The law of contradiction, as Marxism-Leninism understands it, means that the main thing in dialectics is division, rather than identity. To sum this up, the Chinese revolutionaries put forward the slogan, "One divides into two," against the Hegelian, "Two fuses into one," emphasizing the primary place of contradiction. Struggle isn't just a bridge between the old identity and the new. No, in fact, identity without contradiction cannot exist. Everything divides into two. This may seem like an overly philosophical point, but it is important for revolutionaries to grasp to avoid errors based in metaphysical thinking. The law of the negation would have it that dialectics is a continuous movement towards unity or synthesis. Mao Zedong argues, on the contrary, that life of dialectics is the continuous movement towards opposites. The Hegelian sequence leaves us with a dialectic that sees unity as absolute, and contradiction as relative, temporary, and conditional. On the contrary, affirmation and negation exist within every moment of every process. Contradictions exist within the very essence of things, not just between them. And it is those internal contradictions that are the primary motivators of change. Qualitative change doesn't result from a drive towards synthesis, but from the transformation of the principal and secondary aspects of a contradiction into their opposites. It isn't by uniting two contradictory things that we make historical progress, but by dividing them. We don't make socialist revolution by uniting with the bourgeoisie. It is true that socialism carries forward elements of capitalist relations of production in the transition to communism, But the main thing isn't to preserve those elements, but to destroy and uproot them piece by piece. Qualitative change results from the quantitative accumulation of force, which changes the balance of power. In privileging identity over struggle, the law of the negation can also put Marxists at risk of a kind of fatalism, where communism exists as the final cause at the end of history, drawing everything towards it as the final identity where everything is ultimately resolved. Communism isn't a final identity without any contradictions. Contradictions will exist within communism as well. Change and progress will continue. History will never end. Again, the law of the negation is useful to a point, but if we don't take it further, we are left open to metaphysical errors. It gives us too linear a description of the dialectical process, and it separates affirmation and negation in a metaphysical way that privileges identity. As Marxism-Leninism has advanced, it has advanced the philosophy of dialectical materialism beyond the metaphysical, linear framework of Hegelianism. Mao accomplished this by theorizing the concepts of the principal contradiction, principal and secondary aspects of contradictions, and the uneven development of contradictions within a process. Mao's writings on dialectical materialism give us a powerful weapon to analyze the forces at work in the complex processes we face. Next in our series, we'll look at how these processes shape history. In the following articles, we'll look at the categories and concepts of the materialist conception of history, that is, historical materialism, and what they offer Marxist-Leninists as theoretical tools for changing the world. On the Negation of the Negation, by J. Sykes, published by Fightback News. Marxism against Pragmatism, by J. Sykes. Marxist-Leninists are practical people. This has been true since Marx wrote his famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Many Marxists might even consider themselves pragmatists, but Marxism and pragmatism, though there may be some superficial similarities, are, in fact, fundamentally opposed. So let's look more closely at this. What is pragmatism? To be a pragmatist means a lot more than just being a practically oriented person concerned with organizing. Pragmatism is a philosophy born in the 19th century in the United States that basically says whatever is useful is true. Ultimately, it is a methodology rooted in subjective idealism. Subjective idealism says that only our minds and mental conceptions exist. Things only exist to the extent that they are perceived. This subjective idealism is the starting point of pragmatism. For the pragmatist, there is no shared, objective, material reality with universal laws. Nothing is objectively true, but only becomes true through the subjective act of inquiry. Because objective truth and necessity are inaccessible at best, any claim to objective truth gives way to whatever is useful to believe. In the 1870s, pragmatism originated from a group in the United States called the Metaphysical Club, which included many prominent professors in the fields of philosophy, psychology, law, and theology. Charles Peirce, Oliver Wendell Holmes, John Fiske, and William James were the most notable pragmatists to come from this club, with John Dewey coming later. Pragmatism in practice generally leads to a kind of eclecticism, taking a bit of this and a bit of that, mixed together in whatever combination is considered useful. Thus, many who have called themselves pragmatists have held a range of views. But for now, let's focus on the point common to all of them, the idea that what is true is whatever works for the pragmatist. William James called this the instrumental view of truth, or truth's cash value. An obvious objection to this is that some truths may in fact be useless, but nonetheless true. Likewise, it is very clear that unscrupulous people often find falsehoods to be very useful. But that only makes sense if we accept that there is an objective reality independent of our subjective experiences and beliefs. This is no problem for the pragmatists who care only about expediency, only what serves self-interest. They can't be bothered by objectivity. The pragmatist is satisfied with whatever is useful for them to believe. All that matters is what gets the job done. We see that when pragmatism says that whatever is useful is true, This begs the question, useful to whom and for what? For the capitalist ruling class, of course, the job just so happens to be whatever keeps capitalism running smoothly and efficiently. If we look at things from the point of view of historical materialism, we see that the mode of production of society gives rise to a dominant ideology that reinforces it. Every mode of thinking is stamped by the brand of a class, and pragmatism is no exception. Pragmatism arose after the Civil War had swept away the slave economy of the South and consolidated the power of northern industrial capital over the country. This was also the period when competitive capitalism was giving way to monopoly capitalism. Religious philosophy and theology were no longer sufficient as ideological weapons of the bourgeoisie. Pragmatism arose to take up this role and became the dominant philosophical expression of the ideology of imperialism and the monopoly capitalist class. Old, traditional ways of thinking were being swept away, and whatever works became the motto of the monopolies as they devoured the economy and set out to seize markets the world over. In the terrain of the capitalist superstructure, the ideology of the ruling class is dominant, and proletarian ideology is secondary. This means capitalist ideology is always exerting pressure upon our thinking. Since the dominant ideology in the superstructure reinforces the economic base, if we don't challenge pragmatist ideology, it is easy to allow it to weasel its way into our thinking and methodology where it can undermine our practice. Harry K. Wells, in his book Pragmatism, Philosophy of Imperialism, identifies 4 features of pragmatism as a methodology: empiricism, individualism, spontaneity, and expedient opportunism. It is important to look at each of these and see how even well-intentioned revolutionaries can make these errors and how one leads to the next. Beginning with empiricism, pragmatism goes all in on practice and despises theory. Pragmatism holds that reality is nothing but our perceptions, and so we can only know what we have directly observed and experienced. It rejects any claim that we can draw universally applicable theoretical lessons from our experiences. Instead, it advocates pluralism and relativism. In other words, what is useful and therefore true for me may not be for you. Therefore, individualism is an obvious outgrowth of this. Since pragmatism thinks only our direct perceptions give us access to knowledge, we are left only with our unique, particular individual experiences. Thus, pragmatism rejects social practice, collective summation, and organizational discipline, especially when they don't align with our individual experiences. Strategic unity of action becomes unthinkable. From there, spontaneity takes the place of planning and strategy. The dialectical relationship between theory and practice is broken, and the focus is narrowed to only the local, immediate work. Long-term goals are sacrificed for the pragmatic demands of our day-to-day work. Instead of working with a plan, we're now just doing things, focused on whatever works for the task at hand. This spontaneity fits perfectly with the capitalist anarchy of production. Finally, pragmatism leads us to expedient opportunism. This view holds that it doesn't matter if we adhere to our principles as long as we get results. Without an analysis built upon the laws of dialectical and historical materialism, and without a sense of historical progress, there is nothing to prevent pragmatism from transforming Marxism into opportunism, as Marxist principles are compromised for whatever works. But to oppose principles to results is a false dichotomy, of course. And it is actually one that sets us up for failure. Our Marxist-Leninist principles are truly the key to our success. Let's look at an example of how this could play out. A revolutionary in the labor movement may correctly say that the immediate tasks of organizing are important, but incorrectly say that the long-term task of party building and winning over the advanced workers from these labor struggles to Marxism isn't practical. They do the hard work of organizing, but intentionally avoid talking to their co-workers about Marxism. Certainly, our work should aim to win all that can be won and strike blows against the enemy. But if we aren't building revolutionary organization and winning the advance to Marxism-Leninism, then we are sacrificing our long-term goals for the immediate tasks in the name of being pragmatic. Similarly, because they think it is expedient, they may make concessions on matters of principle in order to build broad unity, tailing behind the backwards. Such an approach concedes leadership to these backwards elements. Instead, revolutionaries should be relying upon the advanced forces to help win over and mobilize the intermediate masses and challenge backwards ideas. In this way, pragmatism is a right opportunist error, and often it is an error made with the best of intentions. We want to get things done, after all, but left unchecked, whatever works can lead us to abandon revolutionary theory, to abandon revolutionary organization, to abandon our long-term goals, and to abandon our principles. Marxism does not agree with pragmatism. When Marxists say that practice is the sole criterion of truth, we don't mean that theory should be set aside. We mean that through social practice, we can know the world and understand its laws of motion. We can study the laws that govern material processes and formulate strategies and tactics with a long-term view. We can use that knowledge to change the world for the better through further practice. This is the only way to revolutionize society and eliminate exploitation and oppression once and for all. Marxism Against Pragmatism by J. Sykes. Idealism or materialism?
For